Hey everyone, Steven here. So last week Warner Brothers made a pretty big announcement about their slate of films set for 2021. They announced that all of their films coming out next year will be released both in theaters and on the HBO Max streaming service on the same day. And all of those films will be included with your HBO Max subscription at no extra charge. Needless to say, the film industry was rocked by this announcement. Over the last few days, we've seen articles, interviews, videos, opinion pieces, all trying to make sense of this, while also trying to figure out what is the lasting effects of a move like this. It's led to some really intriguing questions like, is this the new norm? Is this how movies will be released moving forward? I mean, Warner Brothers says this is just a one-year plan in response to the global pandemic, but as we know, a change like this is not easily taken back. Will other movie studios follow suit? I think in the coming days and weeks, we will see how other studios will respond to this as they prepare their release plans for next year. Other questions are, how will theaters survive this? How will film productions be affected by this? How will the budgets for films be affected? And most importantly, how will this affect what type of films are made? These are all great questions, and we could sit here all day dissecting every single one of them. But we're not going to do that. The reason for this video is because when I heard this announcement, my brain went in a totally different direction. The first thing I thought of was, oh my goodness, we're about to bear witness to a whole new era of filmmaking. Now you may be wondering, how did my brain get from movies going to streaming to new era of filmmaking? Well, if we look at the last 50 years of filmmaking, I think we can put together a pretty interesting pattern. And don't worry, I'm going to take 50 years of film history and shrink it down for you. So before we get started, let's get comfortable. You know what? Yeah, let's head over there. All right, to paraphrase Sophia from the Golden Girls, picture it, Hollywood, early to mid 1960s. The film industry was going through a period of transition and change. A lot of the studio heads and executives who had managed the studios through the previous decades were now retiring and stepping down, and new executives were coming in. There was a cultural revolution happening all throughout society, and at the same time, the films that the studios were making were no longer resonating with their present-day audiences. As executives tried to figure out what they could do to breathe new life and generate revenue into the film industry, they tried something different. They turned to a group of young and emerging filmmakers and gave them the opportunity to make something new. Sure, they weren't given a lot of money, and maybe some of their ideas were a bit radical, but they were given the freedom to tell the stories they wanted to tell, and they made the movies the way they wanted to make them. And they ended up changing the course of the entire film industry. Maybe you've heard of some of these filmmakers: Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, the list goes on. And the films they made during that period of time, late 60s into throughout the 70s, was incredible. I mean, there's a reason it's called the greatest era of American cinema. The Godfather, Star Wars, Jaws, Taxi Driver, I mean, the list just goes on. This generation of filmmakers ended up changing the entire game. Let's move forward a few more years, and let's go into the 1980s. Now, these filmmakers we listed they continued making great films during that time and adding to their filmography. But due to the success of the previous decade, studios now had money to play with. The industry had been reinvigorated. But at the same time, they were starting to just churn out movies faster and faster and faster. And we were starting to see more of what we now call the blockbuster being released. See, after seeing the success in the 70s of Star Wars and Jaws, studios were like, hey, let's do that as well. Those movies made big money. They seeped into pop culture. So they started pouring resources into that. And that's why when we think of the 1980s, what are the films we think of? We think of franchises. Back to the Future, Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, the list just goes on again. But if you notice throughout the 80s, there wasn't really a resurgence of smaller films or more unique films. Everything was kind of corporate in a way. Yes, all the films that made were fantastic and they're classics and we love them, but it was a lot of the same thing. You started to see the formula. Then, at the same time, you were beginning to see the emergence of VHS in the average household, along with the rise of video stores. Studios who were once totally against VHS had now embraced it, and they realized there was money to be made there. To the point that they were like, hey, what if we started making smaller, just budgeted films and put them direct to video? It makes more sales, more rentals. And in a way, that's how the horror genre boomed throughout the 80s. Now, in the midst of all of that, for lack of a better term, the excess of it all, underneath the surface, there was another shift beginning to happen. See, there was this next generation of filmmakers that were rising up, who they grew up influenced by the filmmakers of the 70s and also the kind of films that came out in the 80s, but they were also living through other cultural revolutions of their time. And because of that, we saw this next generation rise through the independent film scene. Filmmakers like Spike Lee, Steven Soderbergh, Kevin Smith, Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, Guillermo del Toro. This crop of filmmakers, along with others, kind of came out of nowhere and was just like, hey, we got something to say. We have stories we want to tell. Whether the films were diving into real themes, whether they were movies that made us laugh but think at the same time, or they were movies that challenged our notion of how a movie can be made, these guys changed the entire landscape for the next couple decades. As a result of that, studios realized, wow, like, people love these movies. So every studio started putting together their own little independent division to help foster and create smaller films while still making big, huge franchise epic movies. Now, of course, throughout the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, we've seen other filmmakers emerge. We've seen new technologies emerge. We've seen changes in filmmaking. We've seen society shifts happen. But we haven't seen it all happen at the same time. And usually you kind of need all those things to happen in order for a new era of filmmaking to emerge. All right, now that we got through the history, let's go back over there. Okay, we don't know what the future holds for the film industry, but I do believe the stage is being set for a whole new era of filmmaking to unfold over the next few years. I mean, it's a perfect storm scenario. We have an industry that's struggling, a distribution method that's struggling. We have cultural changes happening at the speed of light all around us. And technology has gone even further into democratizing filmmaking. I mean, it almost sounds cliche, but literally all you have to do is pull the phone out of your pocket and start making a movie. I believe over the next few years, we're going to see the next influential generation of filmmakers who not only change the type of films that are made, they're going to change how films are made and even how they're distributed. Look, Bob Dylan said it best. The times they are a-changin', and I, for one, am excited to see what change comes. Until next time, take care.